What's up guys, Jimmy here. Today I want to finally talk about the netcode patch that we got a little bit over a month ago. That's quite a lot of time to play Street Fighter with the new patch, and I have quite a lot of thoughts on this topic as well. So in general, I want to divide this video into three parts. I want to first give you a technical explanation on what Capcom actually changed with the netcode. Then we're going to talk about my experience with the game with the new netcode, and there's been a new patch announced already for the matchmaking this time around. I want to talk about that briefly as well. So let's start with the technical explanation of what happened with the netcode. So according to some very early feedback, the netcode was not changed at all. They just removed the Altimore patch. This was, by the way, the most probable outcome that I predicted in my previous video on this topic. But I just had to play one game, and I noticed immediately the netcode behaves very, very differently now. So it was kind of mind-blowing to me to see how easy it is to spread misinformation. There was some big creators out there who propagated this new info, and partially I can't even blame them, really. If you think about it, this was Capcom's mistake, at least partially. The reason why I say Capcom has to take part of the blame is because of their really bad communication. I don't really understand why Ono has to put out a cryptic tweet that we have to decipher to understand when the patch is going to go live. He just said, okay, like within this certain week there's going to be server maintenance and the patch will be applied after that. Why not just tell us when that's going to happen? Or at the very least, if you're not quite sure when the server maintenance is going to happen, just tell us when you're tweeting about the server maintenance that this is the netcode patch. It's not that difficult, and somehow Capcom keeps messing with the community like that. So people were skeptical about this, and rightfully so. The servers went down, there was no tweet, no information whatsoever about the netcode patch, and whenever the servers go down, you can already update to the next version of the game. You can't, but obviously you can't play online, right? So people downloaded the patch while the servers were down, and they noticed that the Altimore patch wouldn't work anymore. The game would simply crash if you had it applied. So that's when people started tweeting, hey, Altimore patch doesn't work anymore. And because Capcom, this is where Capcom could have made a difference right there. If they had announced that the servers were going to go down, at least give us like a really, really brief overview of what they changed, like Altimore patch removed, netcode updated in some kind of form. Even like a really, really basic overview would have been good enough. But because people didn't have anything, they just assumed the netcode patch is removing the Altimore patch. But at the same time, there's so many people in the community who propagated this idea that there was definitely no netcode patch, even though we simply didn't know. The patch wasn't really live yet, so nobody could have really known. And as I said earlier, it really only took one game for me to realize that the netcode was indeed patched. So if anything, it kind of shows the state of the community and how little faith they have in Capcom, and rightfully so. Like, I can't even blame them. So, and I was really close to tweeting this myself, by the way. I got multiple tweets coming at me telling me that there was no patch, they just removed the Altimore fix. And I was really close to tweeting about it, told you guys, because that's what my expectation was as well. So I guess this is a learning experience for like both Capcom and the community. But yeah, now let's move on to some technical information about what was actually changed about the netcode. So before the netcode patch, the game would allow two players in a match to be separated from one another by 15 frames max. That was the limit that was set by the game. I'm not even sure what the game would do if players would like be 15 frames apart. Maybe it would just disconnect. 15 frames is a lot, and a game would be unplayable if that happened. So I wouldn't really blame the game for like literally just disconnecting whenever that happened. But anyways, what this means is the game allowed for a lot of rollback to occur. Let's say your opponent was 10 frames ahead of you, you would get a lot of rollback from that. And obviously that would be unplayable. The good thing about the rollback netcode, like the big strength about it, is supposed to be you can input stuff and it'll always come out as if it's offline gameplay. So if you press a medium punch, it'll come out exactly the same way with the exact same timing, as if it was offline gameplay. That's the thing about, that's the cool thing about rollback netcode. It doesn't give you different muscle memory for combos and stuff like that, which is why it's so important for fighting games to have rollback netcode. So with the old netcode, the game would allow a player to be 15 frames ahead of another, which is quite a lot, as I said. The new netcode not only reduces this value, but also makes it dependent on the ping itself. This information was provided by Tool Assisted, by the way, so shouts to him. Thank you so much for providing this interesting information to the community. If you have a ping of around 40 to 50 millisecond, the game will allow you to be ahead by 3 frames max. If you're at 80 to 90 millisecond, it's 5 frames, and at 110 to 120 milliseconds of ping, you're allowed to be ahead by 6 frames. Now, this is quite interesting because you will reach this state where you're at the maximum amount of frames ahead a lot more frequently because the value is so much lower. And what happens when you reach that? So now, instead of, as I said, I'm assuming the game would disconnect with the old netcode. I'm not quite sure about it, to be honest. But in any case, now the game tries to resync mid-match. This has certainly not happened before this patch, and this was something that people have been asking about for a long time, because it was very obvious to basically anyone who's playing. The longer the round goes on, the more desync the match becomes, and it's really frustrating because you start out the match with a good connection quality and somehow you end with a lot of rollback. And this is something that actually changed now because the game tries to resync if it desyncs by more than the amount of frames specified. And more importantly as well, the game checks the ping on a second-by-second basis now. Previously, and by the way, this is information that Capcom themselves, they provided that. So previously, the game would take an average ping for the last 8 seconds. I'm not quite sure why they decided to do that. Maybe it's because they only synced up 2 machines once at the start of the round, and maybe they didn't want to have like a lag spike at the start of the round to completely annihilate the sync feature like that. So now, because syncs always happen mid-match, this isn't necessary anymore. So instead, the game will look up the ping, or it will take a look at the actual ping every second. So this should theoretically result in a lot less one-sided rollback. Since the game tries to sync up the machines all the time, it cannot possibly happen anymore that you feel like your opponent doesn't experience any lag, and on your end it's unplayable. This should not happen anymore. Whenever it's unplayable for you, it should also be unplayable for your opponent because of the resync feature. And I guess this is a good moment for me to tell you guys about my experience with the netcode since the patch. So on the first day of the netcode patch, I was blown away by the amount of good connection qualities that I got on that day. It was mind-blowing. It was like such a crazy difference. I was like, how was I ever playing with the old netcode and enjoying myself? I want to make a video about that. I wanted to immediately talk about how good the new netcode is, and then I realized at some point, I'm not quite sure what even happened. Like, for some reason, I didn't get to make that video. But anyways, what happened was a couple of days later, I had a really bad day. I had a day where like the matches and like I had this experience before as well. Even on the first day, there was like one match or so that had so many stutters going on that was unplayable. But it was really an exception, and you felt like that was an exception. That's not what it's normally like. But there was an entire day where I only got these weird stutter issues all the time. And then I really got reminded of the Street Fighter V online experience. And like, this is not a coincidence. There are some good Street Fighter V days and there are some bad Street Fighter V days. Until this day, we can't figure out what the variable is that is causing this. So this is why I also think Capcom might have not considered patching the netcode for such a long time. It might not be the main culprit of like bad experiences. Even with the new netcode patch, I felt like there were days where for some reason games desync way more often. And if a game desyncs, if two players desync constantly during a match, then the game will constantly try to resync. And this resync feature caused some problems, and this is why Capcom didn't want to do this at first, because it fundamentally alters the way that rollback netcode handles connection quality. So earlier I said the biggest strength of the rollback netcode is the idea that you press a button and it feels like offline gameplay. And the resync feature really goes against that philosophy. It's not that simple anymore. Now what can happen if you press a button while the game is trying to resync, it'll actually drop your input. This has not happened before, and it's really a new issue of the new netcode. And a lot of people have been actually complaining about this. Even since day one, they said, hey, this netcode is actually worse. And I can understand where they're coming from. I still think the new netcode is better, by the way, because it's worth getting rid of one-sided rollback and adding stutters from time to time. And the idea is it shouldn't stutter if you have a good connection to your opponent anyways, because the game should not have to resync in the first place. So this is the problem with the new netcode. Whenever it does have to resync, it actually sacrifices the main advantage of rollback netcode. You will drop inputs, and it's really frustrating whenever that happens. And it happened to me so many times, and once again, I had a couple of really bad days with the netcode where basically every match it was resyncing constantly. And this is also where we get to this discussion about the max frames ahead thing being dependent on ping is quite interesting, because even in the event of me having bad experiences, it's almost never a ping problem. And because it's almost never a ping problem, my opponent is not allowed to be ahead by a lot. So if my opponent has a good ping and it keeps desyncing anyways, the game will constantly stutter as a result. And I think this is the main problem. This is like the 50% of the problem that Capcom did not address with the netcode at all. It desyncs, and I don't even know why. I know my opponent is on a wired connection. I know the ping is good because I literally bought a router to check this kind of stuff. So I know my opponent, it's not my opponent's fault. There's nothing wrong, and it should work just fine. But it doesn't. It just doesn't. And I'm still questioning why this is the case. I've always complained about the server interfering in some kind of way. I'm still not sure if this is actually true or not. I can only speculate on this. But what I know is a big problem in the netcode has not been addressed so far, and that is, why does the game desync so frequently anyways? And why is it like dependent on the day? It doesn't seem to make any sense. There are certain days where everyone works fine, and there are others where basically I can't find a single opponent that doesn't stutter like crazy. There's also another problem that might be worth investigating a little bit more. There might even be, I might even make a separate video on the problems that occur specifically because of the resync feature. Because it's not just dropped inputs that can occur, it's actually the buffer system of Street Fighter being completely messed with. Because I've noticed there's a problem that I never had before in Street Fighter V, and that is like a specific buffer that I use is really weird all of a sudden. And I want to show you this footage as well, where you can see it. Whenever I dash up and I want to throw a fireball after that, all of a sudden I get a Shoryuken instead. This is a common problem to beginners, because what they do is they hold forward and then they do a fireball motion, and because they don't wait long enough, they'll get a DP. This is totally normal, and it's something that I obviously know about. And so what a player like myself would do in this instance is I dash, and then I wait a couple of frames. Specifically, you have to wait at least 8 frames before you input the fireball motion, because the DP has 8 frames of buffer for the motion. So if you're outside that 8-frame buffer, you can't get a DP anymore. So I think what's happening is, because I'm so accurate with the timing of like when exactly I'm going to be outside of that buffer, let's say I input the fireball on the 9th frame of the buffer that I'm expecting to hit, right? Like that would be like exactly 1 frame away from the DP input, and I would get a fireball instead. Fireball has a 12 frame buffer, by the way, just in case you want to know. In any case, the stutter, the resync feature, makes the game halt for a frame, or maybe even longer than that. So because whenever the game is resyncing, the game is frozen in a state, right? But my muscle memory is not frozen. So I wait for exactly 9 frames, I input the fireball, and I get a DP. Why? Because the game used 2 of my frames that I thought were used for the buffer, basically. Those 2 frames, the game was frozen, so the buffer is actually prolonged as a result, because the game is frozen. This is just a theory right now, but I've noticed I constantly miss this all of a sudden. I dash up, I wait a bit, I throw the fireball, but I get a DP instead. And I want to investigate this a little bit further. This is potentially a new problem because of the stutter, the resync feature of the new netcode. As I said, this might actually be worth investigating quite a lot, because there are a lot of like ramifications for this kind of change in gameplay. It makes the online versus like the offline versus online question even bigger. Online gameplay is even more dramatically altered. And as I said, the rollback netcode, one of the big advantages of it, it's kind of sacrificed with the resync feature. And yeah, I guess this is really worth taking a second look into. So yeah, that's basically my experience so far. Overall, I do prefer the new netcode over the old one, especially when the game runs fine, or when I feel like there's a good Street Fighter V day. There's basically no rollback, and there's basically no big resync issues, and it's awesome. It feels great, it feels exactly like it should be. But yeah, there are still these days where nothing appears to be working. The game constantly resyncs, and it makes the flow of the game, it destroys it entirely. So yeah, I really wish Capcom could take a look at why the game desyncs so frequently. That would be awesome, and I think if they can figure that out, I think Street Fighter, like, really, this would be the next step for online gameplay for any fighting game. That would be perfect. So now let's briefly talk about the matchmaking update that Capcom announced. This is really surprising. I didn't expect Capcom to pull out this, like, so many new patches and announcements so quickly, and I'm really wondering what the motivation is behind that. I've always talked about this, about like, why would Capcom fix the netcode right now? They have waited for such a long time. Why do it right now? Why are they announcing a matchmaking update right now? And my speculation for this, and I know, like, this is like, really, I need my tinfoil hat. I don't have one right now, but imagine I'm wearing one right now. It's basically, I really think Capcom is developing some kind of new fighting game right now, and they're in this state where they're developing the matchmaking and everything. So why not use Street Fighter V as a beta test for that, right? Because I really just can't wrap my head around this idea that Capcom now all of a sudden realizes how important the matchmaking is. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, and I'm really skeptical about the motivation behind it as a result. I specifically bought a router to get around the matchmaking problem anyways, so I feel like I'm not even affected by this at all. I can see where my opponent is from before I accept a match in Street Fighter V, because if you set Street Fighter V to 5 only, it'll still give you opponents that are simply way too far away. And this is really frustrating, and it was so frustrating that I bought a new router to specifically fix the problem. That was the problem, by the way. That was part of the reason why I dropped the game in the first place. It was so bad, which is why I thought this was a high priority thing for Capcom to fix, but I was very wrong about that. I'm really happy I bought that router. It doesn't make connections better or anything like that. This is something that a lot of people, I think, They think the NetDuma router it makes connection quality better, but in my opinion, what it does is it really just gives me the ability to see the ping of my opponent, and also to decline opponents that are simply too far away. So that's the big plus of it. I'm basically manually fixing the matchmaking, as a result. I'm really curious what Capcom has in store for us, though. There's definitely going to be an update about that once that comes out. Like in 2 days, we can expect the matchmaking update to, or at least there's going to be an announcement for the date of the matchmaking update. I think something like that. Ono, as always, isn't very accurate with this information, but I guess we'll see. Matchmaking update is definitely coming. I'm going to be talking about it to see what kind of changes they have for us in store. But yeah, for now, that's basically it. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you soon.